The desert night was still when the first explosion tore through the American base. Sirens screamed, floodlights snapped on, and soldiers sprinted for cover as a swarm of drones descended out of the darkness. Small, cheap, and almost silent, they came in waves, their engines buzzing like angry insects as they streaked toward fuel depots, barracks, and hangars. Seconds later, rockets rained down from the hills beyond the perimeter, the sky flashing with fire. Inside the base, chaos erupted. Air defense crews scrambled to man their positions, Stinger teams firing desperately into the night. Interceptor missiles arced upward, striking some of the drones in midair, but too many slipped through. One detonated inside a motor pool, sending Humvees flipping like toys. Another slammed into a warehouse stacked with supplies, igniting a fireball that lit the desert for miles. Soldiers crouched in bunkers felt the ground shake with every impact. Communications channels overloaded as reports poured in. Multiple bases hit nearly simultaneously. Al-Tanf, Kanoko, Green Village, all under fire. American commanders realized within minutes this was not a single militia strike. It was a coordinated assault, planned with precision, meant to overwhelm every defense at once. Casualties mounted. Medics rushed stretchers through smoke-filled corridors, their faces lit red by emergency lights. Overhead, drones still circled, loitering before diving into whatever targets remained intact. A young soldier whispered into a radio, "We can't hold them off." It was the kind of phrase that never left after being spoken. Thousands of miles away, satellites confirmed the strikes in real time. Screens lit up in Washington, Qatar, and Germany as Pentagon analysts watched the attacks unfold. At CENTCOM, generals leaned over maps, tracing the arcs of incoming fire. The signatures matched known Iranian drone designs, cheap but deadly machines that had already devastated targets in Yemen and Ukraine. But this time, they weren't just aimed at proxies or allies. They were aimed directly at U.S. forces. Across the region, panic spread. In Tel Aviv, defense officials tracked the same launches, wondering if the drones might swing west toward Israel. In Riyadh, Saudi officials demanded to know whether their oil fields would be next. And in capitals across Europe, headlines rolled in with the same grim words, U.S. bases under fire. The desert burned as the night stretched on. Black smoke curled upward from fuel depots. Sirens wailed over the crackle of flames, and exhausted soldiers stood guard against the next wave. They knew it was coming. Every man and woman in uniform understood that once a strike of this scale had been launched, it was not a single attack. It was the beginning of a campaign. And before we continue, let me ask you this. Where are you watching from? Because whether you're in the Middle East, Europe, or America, this story touches all of us. Drop your country in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed, because the next strike could change history overnight. By dawn, the smoke still hung over the Syrian desert, the fires still smoldered, and the survivors still counted their wounded. But the world beyond the wire now understood the truth. America's bases were not untouchable, they were under siege. The order went out before the fires were even under control. Scramble everything that could fly. Engines roared across the tarmac as F-15s and F-16s clawed into the sky above Syria, afterburners turning the night into a streak of fire. Surveillance drones were launched to trace the flight paths of the incoming swarms, their cameras scanning for launch sites hidden among desert ridges and villages along the border. In the operations center, American commanders shouted into headsets, piecing together fragmented reports. Dozens of drones had been destroyed, but dozens more had slipped through. Warehouses were still burning, barracks reduced to rubble. At least 4 soldiers were confirmed dead, many more wounded. The scale was undeniable. This wasn't harassment, it was war by another name. Retaliation came swiftly. Within hours, U.S. jets pounded suspected launch positions across eastern Syria. Precision bombs rained down on mud-walled compounds, missile trucks hidden in orchards, and camouflaged firing points in the desert. Explosions lit up the horizon, turning the ground beneath militia fighters into molten earth. But even as the bombs fell, commanders knew it wasn't enough. The groups responsible were ghosts, scattering across the countryside, blending into villages, moving their weapons through tunnels and across borders. Every strike risked hitting empty ground, while the attackers melted away to prepare the next assault. At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, CENTCOM's nerve center, the debate intensified. Some officers argued for a wider campaign, not just against local militias, but against the supply chains that fed them. Others pushed for direct action against Iranian assets, claiming the evidence was clear. Without Tehran's drones, guidance systems, and money, such an attack could never have been coordinated. The president's advisors were briefed with two stark choices: escalate now and risk a regional war, or limit retaliation and risk emboldening Iran further. Meanwhile, on the ground, soldiers reinforced the bases like fortresses under siege. New barriers were erected, radar towers recalibrated, anti-drone jammers activated around the clock. Convoys moved under heavy escort, helicopters sweeping ahead to check every ridge and tree line. The war in Syria, long considered a frozen conflict, had suddenly shifted into something raw and immediate. Allies watched nervously. Israel warned that the same drones striking American bases could be turned against Tel Aviv at any moment. Saudi Arabia demanded U.S. protection for its oil infrastructure, still haunted by the memory of drone strikes that once knocked half its production offline. Across the Gulf, diplomats whispered that America was being bled, stretched thinner and thinner, forced to defend everywhere at once. And this raises the question, what should Washington do now? Strike directly at Iran and risk igniting the region, or hold back and risk more American lives? What do you think? Back at the smoldering bases, the soldiers had no time for strategy. They dug in, patched wounds, and scanned the skies. The attack had ended, but everyone knew it was only the beginning. The silence of the desert was not peace. It was the pause before the next wave. By morning, the desert sky was thick with smoke trails. But in Tehran, the mood was triumphant. State television broadcast endless footage of rockets firing into the night, commentators declaring the strikes a victory for the resistance. Crowds gathered in public squares, waving flags and chanting slogans, convinced that Iran had dealt the United States a humiliating blow. Officials boasted that American troops were no longer safe, that their presence in the Middle East was fragile, temporary, doomed to collapse. In Damascus, the regime celebrated quietly. For years, it had condemned the U.S. presence as an occupation, and now it watched with satisfaction as American bases burned. Yet, even Syria's leaders feared what might come next. A full-scale clash between Washington and Tehran could turn their country back into a battlefield of giants. Its towns and cities caught once again in the crossfire of powers beyond their control. In Tel Aviv, the reaction was sharp. Israeli intelligence tracked the same drones that had struck American bases, noting their range, speed, and payload. Generals concluded that if those swarms were turned west, Israel's own defenses would be tested like never before. Arrow interceptors and Iron Dome batteries were placed on high alert, and fighter squadrons stood ready. For Israel, the message was unmistakable. An attack on U.S. forces today could be a rehearsal for something larger tomorrow. Across the Gulf, panic rippled. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates summoned American diplomats, demanding immediate reinforcement of missile defenses around oil fields and refineries. The memory of the 2019 drone attack on Abqaiq, which had crippled Saudi oil production overnight, still haunted them. Now, watching the strikes in Syria, leaders feared their vast energy infrastructure could be next. Russia watched the chaos with satisfaction. Official statements called for restraint. But behind closed doors, Moscow's analysts knew the truth. Every strike that tied down American forces in Syria was a distraction from Ukraine, a shift of resources away from Europe. Russian state media framed the attacks as proof that Washington was overstretched, a declining empire under siege on too many fronts. China played a different game. Beijing's diplomats urged calm in public, calling for dialogue and de-escalation, but in private, they took note. Every drone that struck an American outpost was a lesson, every missile a test of U.S. resolve. For China's leaders, watching from the other side of the world, the Middle East was becoming a proving ground that might one day inform a confrontation closer to home. Markets reeled as the news spread. Oil prices soared to levels not seen in years. Airlines canceled flights across the region, and investors whispered of a global shock that could ripple far beyond the Middle East. A single night of drone strikes had shaken not only the battlefield, but the economy of the world. And so the question grows larger. Is this the start of a regional campaign to drive America out of the Middle East entirely? Or just the opening shot in a much bigger war between Washington and Tehran? What do you think? The fires in Syria had barely cooled, but already the region felt different. Allies doubted, rivals celebrated, and great powers calculated their next moves. The bases were under fire, and the war that no one declared had already begun. The second strike came just 3 nights later. The soldiers at the bases had barely finished burying their dead, barely patched the holes in the fences, when the horizon lit up once more. This time, it was not just drones. Cruise missiles streaked in low across the desert, hugging the ground to avoid detection, their engines whispering until the final seconds before impact. The alarms blared again. Air defenses fired desperately, interceptors carving arcs into the night, tracer rounds stitching the sky. Some of the incoming missiles were destroyed, erupting in blossoms of fire midair. But others slipped through. One slammed into a barracks, tearing it apart in a thunderous blast. Another punched through the roof of a command building, detonating deep inside. The casualties were heavier this time. Medics rushed into flames, pulling survivors from rubble, the cries of the wounded echoing across the base. In Washington, the Situation Room filled within minutes. The president was briefed on live feeds showing American soldiers under fire, body bags being carried through smoke, bases burning again. The reports confirmed what many already suspected. The weapons had Iranian fingerprints all over them. Guidance systems, components, even the flight patterns matched designs Tehran had boasted of in recent years. The debate turned white-hot. Hawks argued that the U.S. could no longer afford restraint. Precision strikes on Iranian territory, not just militias, were the only answer. Anything less would invite more attacks. Others warned that such a move could ignite a war stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, pulling in Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, and perhaps even Russia. The choice was simple but catastrophic: strike now and risk escalation, or hold back and risk bleeding to death, one base at a time. On the ground in Syria, reinforcements poured in. Convoys of armored vehicles rumbled through the desert, helicopters sweeping overhead with searchlights cutting through the night. Engineers raced to fortify the perimeter, laying new barriers, digging deeper bunkers. But the soldiers knew, no matter how many sandbags they piled, no wall could stop a weapon moving 10 times faster than sound or slipping in low beneath the radar. The funerals back home made the headlines. Rows of flags draped over coffins, families clutching photographs, commanders speaking of sacrifice and honor. But beneath the solemn words was a question that could no longer be avoided. How many more lives would be lost before America decided whether to fight or withdraw? Allies held their breath. Israel prepared strike packages against Iranian proxies, waiting for a green light. Gulf states quietly evacuated Western contractors from oil fields. Europe urged diplomacy, but their warnings carried little weight as the fires in Syria burned brighter. And here's the dilemma. Should the U.S. surge more troops into Syria, doubling down on a fight with no clear end, or pull out entirely and risk leaving the Middle East to Iran and Russia? What would you choose? The desert night grew quiet again after the explosions, but it was not the peace of safety. It was the silence of exhaustion, of soldiers standing guard knowing another attack would come. The bases were still under fire, and Washington was running out of time to decide how far it was willing to go. The smoke over the Syrian desert hung for days, drifting across ruined hangars and scorched barracks. The ground was blackened where fuel depots had burned, twisted steel and shattered vehicles scattered like bones in the sand. For the soldiers still standing guard, the silence felt heavier than the explosions. They knew the next wave was only a matter of time. In Washington, the debates grew more bitter. Some demanded decisive strikes on Tehran itself, insisting that anything less would show weakness. Others warned that a war with Iran could spread beyond Syria, igniting the entire Middle East, drawing in Russia, and shaking the world economy to its core. The president listened, but the choices all carried the same weight: escalation or retreat. Both paths carried disaster. In Tehran, the celebrations continued. Officials boasted that America could no longer act without fear of retaliation, that its soldiers were prisoners of bases turned into targets. For them, the message was simple: the age of U.S. dominance in the region was ending. But for the families of the fallen, there was no celebration, just folded flags, unanswered questions, and the fear that their loved ones had died in a war that wasn't declared, in a place most Americans had forgotten. And now, the world stands on a knife's edge. Every drone in the sky, every missile launched from the desert, risks triggering a chain reaction that could spiral far beyond Syria. The Middle East has been a graveyard of empires before, and the warning signs are clear. The question is simple and terrifying. Will the United States fight to hold its ground, or will these strikes be remembered as the beginning of its retreat from the region? What do you think? The bases are still under fire. The countdown has already begun. So, if you want to follow the flashpoints that could erupt into the wars of tomorrow, make sure you're subscribed, because the next attack may not stop at Syria.